So for the professors in the room, at least the people who were paying attention to the news 25 years ago, this might not be a surprise. But for people of my age and younger, the generation and generations that have grown up with the apartheid regime in South Africa so demonized in our media, this might be a little bit surprising. For those who participated in the anti-apartheid struggle here in Canada, it's much less surprising because those people know that they were fighting against Canada's support to apartheid South Africa. And the first way in which Canada has sort of aided apartheid was by, as an example. So South African officials regularly came to Canada to check out First Nations reserves as a model to take back to South Africa to control the black population. So the way that we in Canada have treated First Nations people was a model for the apartheid South Africa. But the sort of myth of Canada opposing the apartheid regime starts with a decision by Prime Minister Diefenbaker in 1961 to support the expulsion of apartheid South Africa from the British Commonwealth. But it wasn't out of principled opposition to apartheid, to the racist regime in South Africa, but it was rather because African and Asian countries that were part of the Commonwealth were threatening to leave the Commonwealth if South Africa was allowed to stay. And Diefenbaker saw that if he wanted to maintain the British Empire's Commonwealth, he had to support getting rid of South Africa or asking South Africa to leave the Commonwealth. And that's borne out by the fact that Canada had preferential trade agreement with apartheid South Africa until 1979. Canadian police were training South African police into the 1970s. Canadian weapons, including from Crown corporations, were making their way to apartheid South Africa until 1978. And in October 1982, the Trudeau government provided 4.91% of an International Monetary Fund vote in support of $1 billion IMF credit to the apartheid regime that was opposed by 68 members of the IMF, opposed by 121 countries at the United Nations General Assembly. And Canada's support for this loan was decisive because it only passed with 51.9%. So 5% from Canada was decisive. And even during the sanctions period, which we have to remember, there were sanctions, the Mulroney government brought sanctions against the apartheid regime because of the movement in this country, the solidarity movement in this country, the anti-apartheid struggle in this country that forced the Canadian government to bring moves. The politicians in Ottawa don't act benevolently unless there's a grassroots movement in our country, here in London, in Montreal, and Vancouver, all around the country. It's only because of this solidarity movement that the Mulroney government brought in sanctions. And even when they brought in sanctions, they were sort of half measures, and Canadian two-way trade between October 1986 and September 1993, still with South Africa, still $1.6 billion. Are people familiar with Patrice Lumumba? Anyone? Got to be doing some African history. So Patrice Lumumba is probably the most important independence leader in Africa. He was killed, and Canada played certainly an indirect role in his assassination. So basically, when Belgium, which was the colonial master in the Congo, when the Congo won its independence in 1960, Patrice Lumumba had a vision of independence that was a bit broader than the Belgian vision. The Belgians wanted to maintain control of the army, and most importantly, maintain control over the Congo's vast mineral resources. Patrice Lumumba saw decolonization as meaning that the Congolese would gain control of their army, that the Congolese would gain control of the country's natural resources, not particularly revolutionary ideas. They shouldn't be, particularly revolutionary ideas, but Belgians saw differently. And they supported a secessionist movement in the east of the country, in the Katanga region, where most of, or much of the country's natural resources lie. And Lumumba, in hindsight, naively, supported a United Nations peacekeeping mission to defend his legitimate government against the secessionist movement. That peacekeeping mission, 1,900 Canadians participated in that so-called peacekeeping mission, was ultimately captured by Washington and used in a way not to defend the legitimate Lumumba government, but actually to undermine Lumumba. Canada was obviously a member of NATO, alongside Belgium, and initially the Congolese rejected Canadian troops, and ultimately the Canadian troops would play an important role in the logistical positions of the UN mission. So for instance, the UN mission, when Lumumba turned to the Eastern Bloc for weapons, after the US refused to send weapons, the UN mission blocked those weapons from coming into the capital for Lumumba's forces to use. When Lumumba tried to get his forces from around the country into the capital because he was deposed in an illegal move supported by the UN, by the president, his troops were not allowed to get into the capital. When Lumumba wanted to take to the radio to rally his forces, the UN troops blocked them from taking the radio. And ultimately, with Canadian involvement, the UN troops handed Lumumba over to CIA, Belgium, and certain Congolese forces who would assassinate Patrice Lumumba. And an internal document from Canadian Foreign Affairs Bureau, External Affairs, explains Canada's Ottawa's thinking on the situation in the Congo. Quote, "An independent Katanga, working with the neighboring British colonies, could serve as a bulwark against the major threat to Western interests that the Lumumba government was becoming." That was the thinking in Ottawa during the mission, and there's numerous instances where the Belgian ambassador in Ottawa was told by Canadian officials that Canada is doing all it can to support Belgian interests in the Congo. The main beneficiary of the assassination of Lumumba was Canadian, US, Belgium, Western mining companies, as well as Western geopolitical interests in Africa. The main Congolese beneficiary of Lumumba's assassination was Joseph Mobutu. Some people might be familiar with Joseph Mobutu. Some people? Okay. He was a dictator for more than 3 decades, stole billions of dollars from the country. In 1964, Mobutu actually came to Ottawa to thank the Canadian government for its role in the United Nations mission, which helped to kill Patrice Lumumba.